welcome back to the Crochet Cakes YouTube channel. My name's Clarissa and today I'm going to be sharing with you 2 ways that I like to crochet the basic granny square. Now, a basic or traditional granny square uses granny stitches and increases in the corners to continue creating our square shape. Today, I'm going to be showing you 2 different ways of making the traditional granny square. The square on the left has no chains in between, and the square on the right is ideal for working up projects that you want to join as you go. Another key point is that I like to start my granny squares in the corners, so I'm going to be showing you how to do that. So let's begin by making my perfect basic granny square number 1, which is this one. For that, I'm going to be using a 5mm crochet hook. This is a Furls Odyssey crochet hook. Sadly, they've been discontinued, so use any hook that you have available to you. Personally, I have a loose gauge when it comes to crochet, so I actually like to use a hook that is 0.25mm smaller than the recommended size. In this case, I'm going to be using a worsted weight yarn, and that recommends a 5.5mm crochet hook, but I'm using a 5mm crochet hook. Now, there are 2 ways that we can start our perfect basic granny square. The first way is that we're going to leave a longish little tail here, and we're going to pull up our yarn a little bit, cross it to create a loop, insert our hook, and we're going to yarn over and pull through. Now with that, we are now going to chain 4. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then we are going to insert our hook into the very first chain that we made. So this chain that I am pressing into with my left hand, that is where we're going to take our crochet hook, put it through there, yarn over, pull through, and then pull through that chain that was on our hook. Now you see that this creates a little bit of a loop. Now, if we're going to start our granny square like this, we need to work into the loop created by the chain of 4. So not here where we've joined, into the loop here. See? Into this loop. So I'm going to demonstrate, hopefully clearer than that. So I'm opening up my chain of 4, and this space here that's created, that's where I'm going to insert my hook. Now, you can do a chain of 3 to substitute your first double crochet, but I like to do a stacked single crochet. So I'm going to insert my hook into that loop, and I'm going to yarn over, pull up a loop, do a single crochet, and then into the left leg of this single crochet that I've just completed, I'm going to insert my hook. Okay, and that is a stacked single crochet. So as I said, starting with a chain of 4 is one of the ways that you can start your granny square. However, you can also start it with a magic loop, and I'm going to be demonstrating that right now. I know some people don't feel that a magic loop is secure enough, but I haven't had issues with it yet, so I'm sticking by it. For the magic loop, we're going to take 2 fingers in our non-dominant hand, take the yarn, pinch it with a thumb, wrap it, the tail, around, and again, we're going to pinch. We're going to insert our hook under and over. We are going to pull up a loop like so, and taking our fingers out, we're going to chain 1 to secure. And this creates this creates a loop that we're going to work into. So again, I'm going to start with a stacked single crochet into that loop. Okay, and now I'm going to work 2 more double crochets into the ring. Okay, so this counts as a granny stitch, right? Because I have the stacked single crochet that replaces the double crochet and 2 more double crochets into my ring. That counts as a granny stitch. Now I'm going to chain 1 and work another granny stitch into the ring. I'm going to chain 1 again and work another granny stitch into the ring. Okay, so far we have 1 granny stitch, a chain 1, our second granny stitch, and a chain 1, our third granny stitch. So in order to complete this first round, I need 1 more granny stitch into the ring. So I'm going to chain 1 again, and I'm going to do another granny stitch into this ring. Okay, I'm going to pull my tail to tighten my magic loop. And now, instead of chaining 1 and slip stitching to my first stitch to close the round, I'm actually going to replace that end chain 1 with a single crochet. And I'll explain why immediately. So again, we're going to insert our hook into this first stitch that we made, and we are going to be doing a single crochet. Okay, this completes our first round of the granny square. Now the reason that I've done a single crochet here is because, as I mentioned in the very beginning of this video, I like to start my granny squares in a corner. I just feel that that gives me a neater finish and I don't actually have to slip stitch to a chain 1 space or anything like that. So how do we work with this single crochet in the corner? Now I'll show you. We're now going to begin round 2. So we're going to do a chain of 1. And now into the space created by closing our round with a single crochet, I'm going to begin a granny stitch. So again, I'm going to insert my hook into that space created by the single crochet, and I'm going to begin with a stacked single crochet. And I'm going to work 2 more double crochets into this space. So after completing this granny stitch, we're going to move to a chain 1 space. And in this chain 1 space, we are going to be working a granny corner. Now the granny corner is going to be worked in the chain 1 space, as I said, and it's going to involve working 2 granny stitches separated by a chain of 1. We are going to be skipping the granny stitch and heading on all the way over to the left for that chain 1 space. And into the chain one space, we're going to be working 2 granny stitches separated by a chain of 1. Remember that a granny stitch is composed of 3 double crochets all made into the same space. This is our first granny stitch complete. So now we are going to chain 1 and work our second granny stitch in the same chain 1 space. We've completed the first granny corner of the round, and we're going to repeat the same for our 2 remaining chain 1 spaces. So in our 2 remaining chain 1 spaces, we're going to be working granny stitch, chain 1, granny stitch, or as I like to call them, a granny corner. So here we go. We're going to start our second full granny corner of the round. We've completed our first granny stitch of the granny corner, so now we are going to chain 1 and work our second granny stitch of the corner right into this chain 1 space. So remember that our granny corners are 2 granny stitches separated by a chain of 1, all worked into the same space. We've worked our last granny corner and now we come upon our beginning corner. So in the beginning, into that single crochet space, we only worked 1 granny stitch. So now we need to complete this corner by working a last granny stitch into this beginning space. And then remember that instead of closing off the round with a chain of 1, we are actually going to be working a single crochet into that first stitch. Remember that by joining the round with a single crochet, we create the equivalent of our chain 1 space, and we are able to start working in a corner. Now, round 3 is going to be the round that we are going to be repeating to grow our granny square in size. So we begin round 3 by chaining 1, and we're going to work a stacked single crochet into the space created by the single crochet. Okay, now we're going to do 2 more double crochets into this space to complete our first granny stitch. All right. So this is the granny corner that we start and we finish off when we close the round, right? So now what we are going to be doing is that we're going to be working granny stitches between our granny stitches. So we have a granny stitch, right between here, we are going to be working a granny stitch. Okay, and now into this chain one space, we are going to work a granny corner. Oh, let me get the lights. The sun kind of left. Okay, so we're going to yarn over and we're going to go over to this chain one space and we're going to do the first granny stitch of our granny corner. Because remember that a granny corner is 2 granny stitches separated by a chain of 1. Okay, now we're going to do our chain 1 and we're going to yarn over and do our second granny stitch into this chain 1 space to complete our granny corner. The repeat for round 3 is going to be work granny stitch between the granny stitches and work granny corners in the chain 1 spaces. So now that we're completed our granny corner, we are going to work a granny stitch between our stitches. Now that we've completed our granny corner, we're going to go over and work a granny stitch between the granny stitches. So right in the space, we're going to work a granny stitch. After completing this granny stitch, we have once again reached a chain 1 space. So into this chain 1 space, we're going to work a granny corner. And that is going to be the repeat for round 3. Granny stitches between the granny stitches and granny corners in the chain 1 spaces. We've completed our granny corner, so now we are once again between 2 granny stitches, and there we're going to be working a granny stitch. When we reach the chain 1 space, we're going to be working a granny corner. And work a granny stitch between the granny stitches. We've now reached our beginning space, and into this space we need to complete the granny corner. So we're going to yarn over and we're going to complete a granny stitch in our beginning chain space. Then remember that we are closing our round with a single crochet into the first stitch. We've closed off round. We've closed off round 3 and we're ready to begin round 4. Now round 4 is a round 3 repeat, and what that means is that in our chain 1 spaces we're going to work granny corners, and between our granny stitches we're going to work granny stitches. So we would start our initial corner right here under the single crochet space, then do 2 granny stitches, and then when we reach the next chain 1 space we would do a granny corner. Now this round 4 is going to be a silent round. I'm going to be working the initial part of the round with you, and then I'm going to go on silent and we will see each other to close off the round. So let's begin round 4 by doing a chain of 1. And into the space created by the single crochet, we are going to do a stacked single crochet. Remember that this stacked single crochet replaces a chain of 3. Now we need to do 2 more double crochets into the same space to complete our granny stitch. Okay, now we are going to skip the granny stitch, and between the granny stitches we're going to be working a granny stitch. So right here we're going to be working a granny stitch. Okay, and now we are once again between 2 granny stitches, so we're going to work a granny stitch. And now that we've reached our chain 1 space, we're going to be doing a granny corner. So a granny corner is 2 granny stitches separated by a chain of 1. So you see the repeat for this round 4 is granny stitches between the granny stitches and granny corners in the chain 1 spaces. I will meet you back here to close our round together. To close off the round, we're going to complete our initial granny corner. So we do a granny stitch into that first space, which is created by a single crochet. And since this is the last granny square round, I'm actually not going to close off the round with a single crochet. I'm actually going to do a chain of 1 and then slip stitch to that first stitch to close the round. So that is our first granny square complete. While I absolutely love the look of this granny square, it's just neat and tidy, this is not the granny square I would make if I'm going to be making a blanket or a project that I could use the join as you go method. As I explained in the single crochet join as you go video, we need chain 1 spaces for that to work well. So I'm putting this aside, and I'm bringing out the second of my perfect granny squares. Now, this one, similarly, I'm going to be beginning it in a corner stitch like I showed you previously, and we're going to begin by working magic loop and a granny stitch into that magic loop. The difference now lies that instead of doing a chain 1 to separate the granny stitches in the first round, we're going to be doing a chain of 2. And now, once again, I'm going to be working a granny stitch into that loop. After completing the granny stitch, we're going to chain 2 again. And we're going to do another granny stitch into the loop. Okay, so now we've done 3 granny stitches, but in order to complete our square, we're going to once again do a chain of 2 and a granny stitch into that loop again. Okay. Now to close our round, instead of doing a chain of 2 or a single crochet, we're actually going to use a half double crochet stitch. So we're going to yarn over here and we're going to insert our hook into that first stitch in the round. Okay. And we're going to yarn over, pull up a loop, and then we're going to yarn over to complete our half double crochet. I'm getting all tangled here. Okay, let me remove my hook, grab that yarn tail to pull that ring tight. Okay, so here we've closed off the first round of our granny square. And you can see the space created by the half double crochet imitates the space created by the chain of 2. Okay, so now I'm going to chain 1 to start round 2 of our second basic granny square. I'm going to once again begin with a stacked single crochet. Then we're going to do 2 more double crochets into that space created by the half double crochets. Okay, now in order to cross over to our chain 2 space, I am going to chain 1. Yeah, you're seeing the difference, right? Now, again, I've reached a chain 2 space, so I'm going to work a granny corner. This time, our granny corner, instead of being granny stitch, chain 1, granny stitch, is going to be granny stitch, chain 2, granny stitch. Okay, so I'm going to start the first of our granny stitches. Now I'm going to chain 2 and do another granny stitch in that same space. Okay, now again, before going to my chain 2 space, which is a corner, I'm going to chain 1. After completing the chain 1, we're going to cross over to our chain 2 space. And into our chain 2 space, we are going to work a granny corner. This time, our granny corner is going to be 2 granny stitches separated by a chain of 2. So here I'm completing the first granny stitch into the space. After completing the first granny stitch, I'm going to chain 2. And I'm going to complete the second granny stitch into the same chain space, so right here. So in this one, because we're doing a chain 1 between our granny stitches and a chain 2 at the corners, we can see that we're creating a much more open granny square. Again, let's bring granny square 1 to compare. Sorry, granny square 1, granny square 2. So I'm going to chain 1, and I've reached a chain 2 space, so I'm going to do a granny corner, chain 2, and a granny corner. Okay, we've reached our initial corner, so here again I'm going to do a granny stitch. And instead of chaining 1 or single crochet join, we're going to do a half double crochet to join. Okay, and we've completed our second round of the granny square. You can see this one is much more open. Okay, now for the third round that I'm going to be doing together with you, we are going to chain 1, and we're going to do a stacked single crochet in the space created by the half double crochet join. And remember that now we're chaining 1 between our granny stitches, and we're working a granny stitch into the chain 1 spaces. So again, chain 1 after completing the granny stitch, and we reach a granny corner, and into the granny corner we're working 2 granny stitches separated by a chain 2 space. We've completed the first granny stitch of our granny corner. Now we're going to chain 2 and work another granny stitch in the chain 2 space to complete our corner. After completing the granny corner, we chain 1 and we work granny stitch in the chain 1 space. Okay, so this is what our square looks like with 3 rounds. It is much more open than this square that I shared at the very beginning. And if we place them on top of each other, you can already see the difference that making that chain 1 space creates, because our 3 round granny square with chain 1 spaces in between is almost as big as our 4 round granny square with no spaces in between the granny stitches. Okay, I'm going to complete this second granny square, and I will meet you back here when I've completed this 3rd round. Remember that for this second granny square, we chain 1 after completing a granny corner, work a granny stitch into the chain 1, granny corner, okay? To continue building our granny square, we would simply keep repeating this round 3 until we had the width or the number of rounds that we wanted. So I'm going to complete one more round in silence so that we can compare this 4 round granny square with this 4 round granny square. As with the previous granny square, I like to do a chain of 2 and then slip stitch to the first stitch when we finish our granny square. So these are our 2 basic granny squares. The one on my left is a more closed version of the granny square, and the one on the right is a more open, probably traditional looking granny square. So let's measure these and see how they compare. Just visually, I can tell you that this granny square is a smidge smaller. So let's measure this, and this is without blocking. Okay, just grabbing a handy dandy ruler, placing it. This is really, when we stretch it, is going to be a 4.5 granny square. So width-wise and obviously length-wise, because it's a square, is going to be 4.5 by 4.5. And this one over here is actually a 4-inch granny square. So 4 by 4. You can see that by not working chain spaces between our granny stitches and only doing a chain of 1 in our granny corners, we have reduced the size of our granny square by 0.5 inches. Thank you so much for joining me today as we make this basic granny square in 2 ways. Let me know which granny square do you prefer, the one on the left or the one on the right. And I will see you in the next video. Bye!